It's the week ending, Saturday the 29th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Rishi Sunak becoming Britain's first Asian Prime Minister, the share price of Meta plunging as the Facebook owner announced profits have halved, and Random House divulging the title and release date for Prince Harry's forthcoming memoir, Spare. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today for our 300th episode, everybody. That is why there is bunting everywhere. From Money Week and the Money Edit, it's Guy Anker. From the One Decision podcast, journalist Julia Macfarlane. And a tremendously exciting new addition to the Week Unwrapped lineup. It is former Top Gear presenter, now YouTube director for Auto Trader, Rory Reid. Hello, Rory.
Hello, Wally. Long time no speak. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Welcome. Now, as a newbie, I'm going to ask you the mandatory question, which is to share something about yourself that we wouldn't be able to discover by Googling you. Stand by, everybody.
Okay. All right. I had a long think about this, and the only thing interesting I could come up with was that I think I was 13 years old, and I tried archery for the first time. And when I did it, I got 15 bullseyes in a row, back to back, with no practice, literally straight in. Every single one went right in the middle. It made the school newspaper, and everyone thought I was some kind of archery prodigy, some kind of Robin Hood of the 1990s.
Did you arrow drop like a mic drop?
I walked out of there, and everyone was like, you know, when you see something you can't quite believe, the entire room was like that. And
he's still living off the glory of this. So why aren't you a professional bowman then?
Because I just thought it was too easy. I was like, what's the point of this? It's not that hard. It's not challenging. I need something to push me.
Okay. Well, we're certainly going to do that today.
And also, I didn't want to try again and mess up and then, find out it was a fluke. But yeah, that's my little known fact.
That's good. And a revealing psychological insight into your psyche as well.
Rory, I did archery on holiday last year. I didn't even get on the board, let alone the bullseye.
You see, that's what I'm worried about. Imagine how I'd feel if the mighty had fallen in the way that you have, Guy. I'm just not touching a bow and arrow ever again now.
Julia, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
There's pressure mounting on the Burmese military.
Yeah, chaotic scenes from Myanmar uploaded by Twitter user Nway Jasmine on Sunday. Julia, what's going on in that video?
So in that video, that's a local protest against the ruling Burmese military. And it's in response to the news this week that dozens of people were killed by airstrikes at this concert in Myanmar. Now, ethnic rebel groups have accused the military of deliberately targeting civilians at this gathering, which was celebrating the local main political organization there called the Kachin Independence Organization. And so hundreds of people had gathered there. It's this mountainous area that's several hundred miles from the country's biggest city, Yangon, and the rebels say that it's nowhere near any kind of infrastructure, but it's a place where motorists will often stop by a market. The Myanmar military have said accusations that it killed civilians are fake news, and that they had actually targeted military installations and the rebels' military base.
Like what? What could they possibly argue was a military installation at a pop concert? I mean, just from their side, what have they put forward?
Well, a military official was on CNN this week, and the spokesman, he said that it was a den where enemies and terrorists were hiding, so we launched this necessary military operation. He told Christian Amanpour that the Tatmadaw, that is the Myanmar Army Armed Forces, he says they've never attacked civilians, and we don't need to clarify any matter in connection with fake news. So there you go. I mean, the ethnic rebels spokesman have told The Guardian that while there were rebel members of those militias at the concert, they were there in a personal capacity. They were helping guests. They were hosting the concert. And actually, some of them were even taking part in that concert. I mean, this is just the latest in a string of violent attacks by the military. Earlier in the summer, there were airstrikes on a school where nearly a dozen people were killed, including several children. I should point out that there have been various rebel groups also staging attacks against the military, against some outposts and towns. And quite recently, there was one attack in a village near the Thai border where military border police were stationed, and thousands of people were sent fleeing across the border into Thailand to escape the fighting.
Okay, so Guy, this seems fairly clearly to be a war crime, but what can the world do about it, really? There's already tremendous sanctions on Myanmar, aren't there, following the military coup in February last year?
I think one thing is awareness. It's what's interesting. The whole idea of the podcast we're all on is the things that go under the radar, and it's quite incredible that this has gone under the radar. I suspect if you do a vox pop on the streets of somewhere in the UK, most people won't know about this. We're so consumed with, understandably, a new prime minister here. There's some very serious issues at play. There's also some issues you could argue are less serious. And if you look at, if I just compare this to some of the coverage of Ukraine, I remember in the immediate aftermath of the Queen's sad passing, which again quite rightly attracted a lot of news, but we missed out at the time on some really important goings on in Ukraine. There was a particular, counter-offensive going on at the time, and you really had to dig into the news, very, very deep into some broadcasts, didn't even make some broadcasts. And it was such an important part of the war. Going back to your question, my point is this. We sometimes choose, don't we, as a society, we care about this war, we don't care about that war. This is such a serious incident. Now, I'm not an expert on, military tribunals and human rights conventions, but what I can see is, as you're saying, Ollie, this is a catastrophe, and we certainly need to do more. My point is, we also, I think, until we raise awareness of what's going on, and we're doing this right now, then it prevents action taken at times, because it sometimes does need that public outcry.
I suppose for that kind of awareness, though, Rory, there needs to be an element of identification, which there clearly is in Ukraine with the European nation. When you look over to Myanmar from a British perspective, it's maybe harder for people to understand what's going on. You've got 80% of the population or more being Buddhists. You have in recent memory Aung San Suu Kyi, being so popular as the face of democracy, but then also responsible for alleged genocide of Muslim Rohingya. So I can understand why awareness is one thing, but it's hard to know sort of whose side you're on, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And there is a sort of danger that it becomes a bit of a forgotten place, or rather a place that's easy to ignore. Somewhere that almost seems beyond help, which itself is quite tragic. We listen to the fighting and the politics on the news, and we do get slightly numb to it. I'm guilty of that. You can ask the average person in the street where Myanmar is, and they probably wouldn't even be able to tell you. And it's a huge shame, because there's a human cost to this that's absolutely tragic. The research that I've done in the build up to this, illustrated that there are something like 1 million refugees in exile. The country's in an absolute shambles right now. People don't have safe spaces to sleep. Medical aid is difficult to come by. There's very limited access to vital services like health and education. Food security is pretty poor on the ground right now. I think it's been nearly 2,000 civilians that have been killed during the hostilities and other fatal incidents, and as a result of landmines and explosive remnants of war. And following the military seizure of power, there was actually, and this is a basic human requirement, but thousands of healthcare workers walked out in protest. I think there were like 300 people that were attacked or threatened, which again leads to the ordinary person in the street not being able to get very, very basic level of care. I mean, we talked about Ukraine earlier on, and how that's easier to relate to because it's pretty much on our doorstep. It's easy to relate to the people that are suffering. But with Myanmar being so far away, there's a danger that we do forget the human aspect, which would be a huge shame. There are charities out there that are trying to do their bit, trying to help. I'd suggest people look into a bit more to see what they can do to help out as well.
Well, across the Asian continent then, Julia, how is this being discussed there?
I mean, it is high on the agenda for ASEAN, which is the network of Southeast Asian nations. And this week on Thursday, foreign ministers actually held an emergency meeting in Jakarta, the Indonesian capital, to discuss directly the airstrikes this week. And there is a bigger gathering that has been booked for November. There have been several failed attempts at trying to get some kind of peace agreement. There was a 5-point plan, which was proposed for Myanmar, and it's difficult because the military is essentially not willing to cease its state executions, the attacks on schools, the extremely violent, bloody oppression to protests and boycotts and other forms of civil disobedience in response to their coup last February 2021. And it's difficult because Myanmar by a long shot, it is the poorest country in Southeast Asia. And it sometimes pops up in the headlines from time to time. We spoke recently to the UN ambassador, who's basically a rogue ambassador. He is loyal to the now ousted and largely detained civilian government that the military overthrew. And you guys might remember where he made that amazing speech at the UN General Assembly just over a year ago, where he held up those 3 fingers, which was alluding to the Hunger Games symbol, which has been adopted by a lot of pro-democratic protesters across Southeast Asia. People do it in Thailand a lot as well. But it's difficult. And what's interesting is that, you know, the military, they are hugely, hugely powerful. You can make a comparison to the Iranian IRGC. They control a lot of business. They control a lot of civilian infrastructure. They have such a grip of control, not just on ruling the country, but also how the country works and operates. And it's very difficult to extricate it. They have for a long time been allied, have a close relationship with China. But interestingly, they've been closer to Russia.
Yeah, well, is that surprising? I mean, don't you just get a sort of new axis of evil 2.0, really? I mean, that's what's happening, isn't it, Guy? Like, Russia doesn't have any friends internationally apart from places like Myanmar and vice versa. So they team up.
And North Korea.
Yeah.
The thing about Myanmar is, you know, if you look back at history, I mean, you can go back decades and decades and decades. Child soldiers, human trafficking, child labour, forced labour. I'm just reading a quote now from one of Barack Obama's special assistants. Serious human rights abuses against civilians in several regions continue, including against women and children. I've just picked that out. You know, I could have picked 100 different quotes. It's a region of the world that has, for decades and decades and decades, has a horrific recent history, and unfortunately, that is under the radar in the parts of the world that we live in.
It's not even recent, though, is it? I was looking into this a little bit more, and like the history of the place reads like a Hollywood movie script. Originally, it was quite a wealthy country because it provided trade routes between China and India. Then the British arrived, and there were 3 separate wars between Burma and Britain before the British gained control. The first war lasted from 1824 to 1826. 15,000 European and Indian soldiers died. We don't know how many Burmese died, quite a few, I'm sure. And the cost of the war, just in monetary terms, was the equivalent of $18 to $48 billion. Then later on, Japan invaded during World War II, and the British came back in. The whole thing just, it reads like someone's just made it all up, but it just keeps on. It's a story that keeps on giving, and it never seems to end.
Taking it out of its historical context, though, Julia, is something that is happening now and unfolding before our eyes. Where do you see this going?
I mean, it's hard to say. I think Rory is so right to point out the history. I mean, some people say that it has the world's oldest civil conflict dating back to 1940s. And so, you know, where does this end? And Myanmar has tried civilian government, and it hasn't worked, even though Aung San Suu Kyi, and she wrecked her international reputation for doing this, trying to work with the Myanmar military. You know, her reticence to stick up for the Rohingya cost her dearly, and it was one that she chose in order to try and preserve the government and, you know, kowtow to the military, essentially, because they hold the real balance of power. It's notable that there haven't really been a strong international arms embargo for Myanmar. There are efforts to try to get the Chinese to row back on their links and their trade with the Myanmar military. But then again, of course, you know, going back to that new axis of evil you mentioned, they they have links with Russia, and Sergei Lavrov has visited Myanmar quite regularly over the last couple of years since the coup. He's been popping up quite recently, and Russia is nowhere near Southeast Asia, but they always send representatives to ASEAN summits, and there will be a Russian representative at the ASEAN summit in November.
Because they can send each other pictures of each other meeting each other, so it looks like you're engaging in diplomacy, right? That's basically it.
Well, I think Russia's obviously dealing with a lot of isolation on the international stage. And I think something that the Chinese are having to grapple with is they now have a number of, quote, allies who just give them headaches. Not just Putin's failed war in Ukraine, but Kim Jong-un going rogue, the Myanmar military also. I mean, none of this is stuff that President Xi is happy about. And so we have to wait and see what kind of regional lead the power players in this conflict will take.
Okay. Guy, I'm coming to you next after this. Okay, Guy, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
As energy prices soar, how you might actually get paid to use less energy.
Well, what we're clear about is that we do have a good supply of energy in the UK. We're in a much better position than many other countries, but of course there's always more we can do, and that's why I'm here working with our partners, making sure we do have a secure energy supply into the future.
I'm reassured, we're all reassured. Liz Truss there, remember her, back at the beginning of the month, coalescing with European allies, trying to prevent energy blackouts, which she promised would not happen. This week, Guy, we've discovered that energy companies have a new way of trying to avoid this too.
Yeah, so that there is this fear, and I must stress it's a worst case scenario according to the National Grid, but there is a fear that we may have some blackouts over winter because of the supply of energy being so low, largely as a result of the war in Ukraine limiting the supplies coming through to us. And what some suppliers are doing, and three in particular so far, British Gas, Octopus and OVO, they're saying, well, we'll actually pay you to use less energy during peak periods, roughly speaking, between 4 and 7 p.m. I say roughly because we don't have full details. They haven't announced the full details. That goes for payments as well. We don't have the full details on payments, but the mood music is suggesting you might get paid up to £100 if you meet certain targets, depending on if you're one of those three suppliers, if you hit those targets. And I should stress, those are just the three that have actually made statements they're going to do this. We do expect lots more to come.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because, those companies make profits when people use energy. It shows that they are concerned. They're paying people to use their product, which would give them more profit less.
Yeah, but you can imagine what's going to happen if you're trying to watch the footy on television or heat your home. British Gas is getting a lot of phone calls, aren't they, if the heating doesn't come on. Now, again, it's a worst case scenario, this. There's two ways we could look at this. We could look at it through the prism of a potential energy shortage. We could also look at it through the prism of energy prices. And as we all know, energy prices have rocketed, and they're probably in April going to rocket again, because the guarantee that our former great leader Liz Truss announced a few weeks ago, feels like a lot more than a few weeks ago. It
feels like a lifetime.
Wasn't that long ago. A month is a long time in politics, let alone a week. The plan was that the current caps on the units of energy would stay in place for a couple of years. They're only going to stay in place for certain until April. So we don't know what's going to happen post-April, but prices are likely to go up for most of us again. And remember, they're already double what they were a year ago. So going back to the point, you can also look at this through the prism of, okay, it's actually a way to save money on energy as well as potentially averting what would be an absolute catastrophe if we did have blackouts.
But Rory, won't this just encourage the people who take the offer up to move their energy consumption to another part of the day? They're not going to be using less energy necessarily. They're just going to be taking a shower at a different time to what they normally do to try and get the money back.
Absolutely. If you move the peak time from, say, 4 to 7, and everyone doesn't turn on their washing machine between 4 and 7, but now they do it from 7 to 10, aren't you effectively sort of creating a slightly offset peak time where it's still a peak, it just happens at a slightly later date? It's a bit of a strange one. It's also, I'm not sure it's sort of like and worth it as well, because when you look at the amount they're offering, like £100, I believe is what they're offering over a 5-month period. And it looks as if you only get that money if you stick to it rigidly and lower your usage every single day during that 5-month period. And doing that for £100, I mean, is it enough incentive? I know it's a worthwhile thing to do. We should all try to use less energy, but it sounds like it might end up being an easy way for them to say, well, on Tuesday, the 15th of December, you didn't quite stick to the plan, so you're not going to get your £100. So it's a bit of a weird one.
Yeah, I mean, in kilowatt hour terms, Julia, £100 feels like nothing now. You know, it used to, if we'd have been discussing this a few years ago, I can get £100 off my energy bill. That sounds like quite a good deal. But actually, Rory's right. If you think about it in terms of bills coming to 4-figure sums, it's marginal.
Right. And look, I'm so glad that you played that clip of Liz Truss, because she's done so much to reassure me on my energy bills. I'm not even thinking about my energy bills because I'm so terrified of my mortgage payments next year. She's really solved the energy crisis for me personally. But I saw a news package ages ago. And this scheme is one that's from the National Grid. It's the National Grid that has come up with this discount for off-peak usage. And Octopus and OVO and British Gas have signed up to it. And it's the National Grid's problem that they're trying to fix. And I saw this business package ages ago, which was at the National Grid, and it was all about how we consume more fuel, more electricity, more everything than we generate ourselves on this island. And with the timing, it was fascinating because we were in this sort of National Grid sort of control center, and there was a man who was there with the switchboard, and he pointed at the clock and he said, look, EastEnders is about to finish. They're about to roll their credits. And as EastEnders went doon 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 doon, there were these lights that flared, which showed that there was suddenly a surge in demand for electricity because all of the nation's households were popping the kettle on.
You're bringing back many memories of my 12-year-old trip to various power stations in Wales that we did with my school.
It was then that this chap essentially flicked a switch, which then basically meant that the UK at that point was importing electricity from France, because it was then that the National Grid was overwhelmed, and so they were pulling in resources from elsewhere. It's tricky to understand. It's all about electricity, sort of, infrastructure, and I don't quite understand it, but I think it is because there is a cost to the National Grid and therefore passed on to customers when there are peak times, and particularly with things like boiling your kettle, which takes up a huge amount of electricity. And so this is one way they're trying and dilute those peaks by spreading out some of the usage throughout the day.
Guy, does this seem less likely that it's going to be needed, actually, even though the scheme is going ahead, it seems, than it would have been perhaps a month ago when Liz Truss was talking? Because there have been factors involving, like, the climate, for example, and the cost of oil, which are pushing things in a direction that are a little bit less scary than perhaps they were then.
Yeah, if you'd asked me that question a couple of weeks ago, I might have had a different answer. Before I say what I'm about to say, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't have a crystal ball. But you're absolutely right. The mood music is slightly better. There are now predictions of not quite a colder winter as we thought of. I genuinely don't understand how anyone can do that far ahead. But hey, those are some of the predictions.
Well, I guess it's that we're already at the end of October and it's not as cold as it usually is. I suppose that's the very basic.
It was 16 degrees last night. I walked the dog with just a jumper.
I know, walking around in a t-shirt on Halloween. What's going on? Yeah.
But we don't know December, January just yet. But yes, the mood music is better than it was. One thing I would say is, the debate, is it worth it? Is it actually going to reduce usage? One thing I should very importantly add, you're only going to possibly be eligible for this if you've got a smart meter where it actually records the time of day you're using energy. I should say, I got one recently. They're really cool, actually. You can see what you're using in pounds and pence as you go along, because things like kilowatt hours mean nothing to anyone. You want to see in pounds and pence.
Has it gamified it a bit for you, Guy? That's what I'm worried about.
It has.
I want to keep a track of my bills. I don't want to keep looking down at a smart meter. I don't need another notification in my life.
Let me be honest with you. My first few weeks of smart meter, I was a bit scared because I got the smart meter. I think it was almost bang on when the prices went up in April. So I didn't want to look at it, but then I kind of knew what my usage was. So I know my ballpark isn't going to change too much. So yes, it does. Once you've got over that fear factor, yes, it does gamify it. Is it worth it? Is it going to work? Julia mentioned a point which I think was really pertinent. It will probably dilute what is the peak time. And I think that's key. The peak time isn't going to suddenly move from 4 to 7 to another time. First of all, there are not enough suppliers taking part. £100 is good. Any money off the bill is good, but like we've said previously on this chat, compared to the average bill, it's not huge. But if it just takes a few people out of that peak time, it will, if it works, it will dilute it. But I would just want to stress again, so we don't scaremonger, we are talking worst case scenario. There are blackouts. So this is their plan for the worst, hope for the best. That's essentially what's going on here. Maybe hope for the best isn't fair on the energy companies because they are actually doing what they can and the national grid is doing what they can. But we are properly talking worst case scenario.
Rory, you've spent a lot of the last 20 years thinking about electric cars and partly kind of persuading your readers and viewers to consider electric cars. What could this mean? This current crisis for people that are powering up their cars. I guess petrol is also not a brilliant option at the moment.
I mean, nothing is it really? But just you mentioned earlier, no one knows what kilowatt hours means. I'll try and put it in a bit of context. I think the average washing machine uses about 0.5 to 1 kilowatt hours per load. Charging an electric car, I think the average electric car is somewhere in the region of 50 kilowatt hours per full battery. Now, you're not going to be charging it to full every single night unless you're driving it hundreds of miles during the day. But it just goes to show how much electricity could be used by an electric car in comparison to, say, a washing machine. What will it mean for people? I think if we end up in a situation where it looks like we do have to ration our energy, it might make people think twice about buying an electric car. But we should also stress that energy prices for petrol prices for diesel and petrol, they'll be affected as well. And I think where we are at the moment is that the total cost of ownership for an electric car is still cheaper than an equivalent petrol or diesel car, despite the higher electricity costs at the moment. So I'd still recommend people go out and buy an electric car, although I have no kind of crystal ball to say what's going to happen next April, and whether the total cost of ownership argument will change then. It might. We'll just have to wait and see. Maybe the best thing is to get a plug-in hybrid. Then you've got the best of both worlds. Normally the worst of both worlds, but it gives you the option of petrol or electric.
Well, I suppose the sort of regulatory hybrid, Julia, is where the government does a bit to lower your bills, but also the energy companies do a bit to lower your bills. And that's, I suppose, what we're seeing here. So you should sort of welcome that, shouldn't you? I mean, the government, it seems, have done everything they can do. They're not going to do any more than this now until April, as we've been saying. So it kind of was incumbent on the energy companies to come up with something. Is this enough?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, there are all kinds of external factors which are out of the government's control. And as long as we see Putin's war in Ukraine, that's obviously going to put pressure on energy prices. And the picture is, I think, bleaker for continental Europe, who import a lot more from the Russians than we do. But of course, it is all a global market, so we are affected by stuff in the continent. But I think what we are beginning to see is people are taking measures themselves to use less energy. People are turning the thermostats down. They are using air fryers and trying not to use their gas hobs. They're trying to line their windows and things. I mean, we've kept our radiator turned down. I've started using the slow cooker. I don't think that I'm eligible for this scheme because I don't have a smart meter, but it has still made me start putting on the washing machine, the dishwasher overnight rather than during the day, because it's just something that I've read about and I've said, okay, that's something that I can change about my daily routine at to little cost about myself, and it may help. And so I think there'll be a lot of people who will be reading this, and it will just affect their daily habits to try and make things easier for the national grid.
Guy's eyes lit up when you said that. What? Is she doing something wrong, Guy?
Yeah, Julia, unless you're on what's called an Economy 7 tariff, Economy 7 is where it does cost less overnight. for listeners who don't know. It doesn't make a difference. And also there's a fight.
Oh, okay.
And also, by the way,
so much for that then.
There is so much demand at the moment out there for people trying to use less. Some of the traffic we're seeing on some of our websites on the Money Edit.
And that is the difference, isn't it? Because, people have been for 20 years looking at Money Saving Expert and all the rest of it. And basically the people who have been really keen on that information have been people who are struggling financially or students or whatever. But now you really do get the sense that middle class, upper middle class, people who subscribe to Money Week, as you were just saying, are interested in this information. Everyone is trying to save money now.
Money Week is predominantly an investment title, not exclusively, predominantly. So therefore, you'd expect people with lots of money to be reading it. Energy coverage is being lapped up by Money Week readers, understandably, because unless you're Richard Branson, unless you're in that category, this affects absolutely everybody. The soaring price of energy. I'm looking, by the way, at charts at the moment for traffic on our websites. Wood-burning stoves versus central heating, which is cheaper? There are a humongous number of people on it right now as we're recording this, reading that. Should I leave the heating on low all day or only put it on when I need? By the way, only put it on when you need, according to the Energy Saving Trust.
Heat the human, not the home. That's the tip, isn't it?
Yes, that's Martin Lewis's words, which are quite right. If you're I'm working from home right now. I don't need the radiator on. But if I did, I'd just have this radiator on in my room. I wouldn't have the ones elsewhere. And Julia, your point, should I use my appliances at night? Unless you're in economy 7, it doesn't make a difference. And I should really say there is also a fire risk at night. I don't want to, completely trounce what you're doing.
I have a home-built fire alarm, which is my dog. So if anything happens, she will absolutely wake me up. But no, that's good to know.
To your point about using a slow cooker as well, I think a slow cooker uses about as much energy as a washing machine as well. You might find that using an electric hob, even though...
I have a gas hob, sadly.
Oh, is it a gas? Okay, all right. I haven't done the calculations for that. But
if you're Indonesian like me and you like making rendang, which should simmer for 7 hours, it's better to use a slow cooker than burn the gas for 7 hours.
You're making me hungry and you're making me want to sit in front of a log fire. So let's move on. Rory, you're up next after this. Okay, Rory, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week when we see a car rocketing to new records?
Yeah, absolutely delighted. Our first 600 mile an hour run. Personally, I'm just a tiny bit miffed. My job is to control the car as precisely as possible, so I was trying to target about 605 just to make sure we got the 6 number. We actually finished up with 628 miles an hour. That is actually outside my control. When I lifted off the throttle, the way the jet engine winds down changes with speed, and it gave us more power for about another half second, and that put the extra speed on, finished up another kilometre further down the track. So that's the major learning point above 600 is the jet engine performance changes. We'll put that in the plan for next year.
Andy Green, driver of the Bloodhound LSR back in 2019. Those are words I feel like I can only say with the delivery of Clarkson, Rory. The Bloodhound LSR. You're going to have to tell us what that is and why it's back in the news this week.
Okay, so the Bloodhound is a vehicle designed to break the world land speed record. It's been in development since, I think, 2008, when it was known as the Bloodhound SSC, supersonic car, and it's now come back as the Bloodhound LSR for land speed record, because it's been through a few ups and a few downs in terms of funding.
So to be clear, it couldn't meet the supersonic threshold it was aiming at before, so they've downgraded what they were aiming at? Is that what happened?
Well, the thing is, it uses 3 engines. One is, imagine it looks a bit like a space rocket that's fallen on its side with a set of wheels bolted on and the tail section of a plane glued on the top for good measure. One engine is a Rolls-Royce jet engine that can take it up to 600 miles an hour. But to get up to the really silly speeds that they want to achieve, they're aiming for 763, they need a rocket engine in addition to that, and they need that rocket engine to have an auxiliary power unit to power that rocket engine. And that engine is a 5-litre supercharged V8 from a Jaguar.
Okay, I can tell from Julia's face that she does not agree with the idea of this vehicle already. But before we get on to that, just tell us what's happened this week.
Okay, so Basically, because we live in a world where people care about the climate now, and having a rocket-powered car doing 700 miles an hour makes no sense to anyone, and hence their difficulty in finding sponsorships. They've reinvented the car, suggesting it could now run on synthetic fuel, which would allow it to be carbon neutral, and they'd swap out the third engine, the V8, for an electric motor to help power the rocket that would take it up to 763, possibly even 1,000 miles an hour.
Okay. And being carbon neutral, that's not just relevant for an 800 mile an hour car, but is actually relevant for the kind of R&D of all of us. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I mean, especially for planes, I think that's where it gets really interesting, because jet fuel is horribly polluting. But if you could somehow create synthetic fuel, and I can possibly give you a really layman's explanation of that in a second if you really want. But if you use synthetic fuel, what you have is a situation where you're capturing carbon from the atmosphere and mixing it with hydrocarbons, and then the process of making it actually removes carbon from the air, but then the process of burning it in a plane, for example, puts it back. So in effect, it's neutral, and therefore you're not putting excess CO2 in the air. And having the Bloodhound run on carbon neutral fuels is possibly a great test bed and a great example of how the technology can be used to maybe reduce the amount of CO2 that planes pump out into the air, possibly even cars as well.
Okay, so there are worthwhile purposes to this, Julia, but before we get on to that, let's just dig into that cynicism that your face is expressing. Would you take a ride in an 800 mile an hour car?
I mean, I think you really need a Y chromosome for this story. I mean, why do you need to go 800 miles an hour? It's so unnecessary. I mean,
you don't is a short answer. Literally, just to see if it's possible.
Yeah. I want you to know, Julie, you're not alone. Producer Sophie has written on my screen, surely the whiplash would be awful.
Well, yeah. No, precisely. I mean, I think exploring synthetic fuels is interesting, and I read Rory's article on this, where there were, people were proposing that it could be a green alternative to fossil fuels until electric cars really become viable enough to replace all of our internal combustion engine vehicles until then. But it's very intensive on use of electricity, which is still largely powered by fossil fuels. There is the argument that a lot of our current infrastructure could handle and supply synthetic fuels, but I didn't realize that the process of burning synthetic fuels still releases carbon into the atmosphere, even if it does use carbon in the process of making it. So I wonder if it's really if it's worth it. But if you're the CEO of Bloodhound, when are you the guy just needs to accept that his idea just find another business idea, because it's bad and it's not worth anyone's time, and no wonder he's running out of sponsors, because it's a stupid car and no one wants to go 800 miles an hour anyway.
I guess if he doesn't do it, guys, someone from America is going to do it, or someone from the UAE is going to do it. That's the point, isn't it? And actually, from that point of view, from a British perspective, you think about developments in vehicles, and you do think about the German manufacturers and the Japanese ones, and Tesla are obviously in the USA. It's quite nice, isn't it? There's a British startup trying.
Yeah, I think someone like Elon Musk would come along, wouldn't he? To break this record. I should say, I was looking up because I was trying to work out what. Trying to break the record of 800 miles an hour. I compared that to a plane. I see an A380 does about 760 miles an hour. So that's faster than an A380 plane. I think the story here, other than would you do it or not? By the way, I would. I'd love to get one of these. FYI.
You didn't need to say, Guy.
FYI. I think, it's this conversation around the types of fuels we use. In terms of, why is it worth... If we move into the why is it worthwhile point of view, because we obviously do need to move away from diesel and petrol. We were talking in the previous segment about the cost of energy, and we talked in part there about how that compares to diesel and petrol. They are incredibly polluting gases and liquids, and things that go into the atmosphere. And and if we break it down to you and I, households, would we go electric and things like that? For lots of people, electric is cheap. It's not cheap, actually, if you don't have the option to plug in at home. I was looking myself last year. I actually ended up getting a diesel, a more recent diesel, so it wasn't one of the 2015 polluting ones, because the cost of, and this was before the energy crisis, the cost of actually charging a car on the street was just horrendous. I've moved into cost here, but that's all part of it. Producing environmentally friendly fuels that are also cost effective is so important for us going forward, but it's also quite cool.
Yeah, and this one, Rory, if I understand it correctly, could, if it develops properly to full fruition, just be used in a normal petrol tank. You could use any old car from the last 10 years with this new fuel straight away. You wouldn't have to convert it. That's the dream, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Porsche are in partnership with a couple of other companies, and they're developing synthetic fuels for their own cars, and particularly for their race series. Formula One is looking at using synthetic fuels from, I think, 2026 onwards. So yes is the answer. And you don't actually need the bloodhound to in any of this. It's literally just a thing for people to go, look what we can do. And it's quite a wasteful thing, if I'm being honest, because when the size of the average fuel tank in a car is about sort of 80 litres. This thing burns through 40 litres every second that it's running. So you're emptying sort of half a tank in a normal car every single second that this bloodhound is charging up towards its 700.
So Rory, you agree with me? It's a stupid idea, and they should just stop it.
Do you know what? I'm a car guy through and through, but it is a stupid idea. There's a reason it hasn't taken off quite yet. I think part of the reason it doesn't look cool either. It's like a rocket's fallen over. It doesn't look like a car, so I can't really go, I'm really excited by this car. It's
like three vehicles strapped together, isn't it? It's like, do you remember in Peep Show where they put the three remote controls together? I think they call it the Megatron. It's that.
Yeah,
as a vehicle.
It is that. It is. It's not sexy, and it's an outdated concept. I think the synthetic fuel thing brings it back into the realm of something a little bit less sort of, a bit more relevant.
I mean, this seems like exciting news, doesn't it, Guy, if you're sitting on the board of Emirates or Virgin Atlantic or whatever, because they're desperate to be seen to be carbon neutral and basically can't achieve that. I mean, they've all said they want to and can't. This could be a way.
If it's successful, yeah. I mean, like you say, airplane manufacturers, right up there in needing to make their fuels more environmentally friendly, because as we've already said, it's one of the greatest pollutants there are is airplanes, and you would expect in time, whether it's through this mechanism or another, that the big airlines, whether it's IAG, whether it's Emirates, whether it's Etihad, whoever, to absolutely get on board if we do find the silver bullet.
All right. I think we've released more than enough gas into the environment for 1 week. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rory. A promising debut. Do come again. And to Julia and Guy as well. You can follow this show for free. It's carbon neutral to do that. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.